Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than Truth. Our guest today is Chris Whipple. Chris is an acclaimed journalist, best-selling author, and documentary filmmaker. He is also the author of the recent book, Uncharted, How Trump Beat Biden, Harris, and the Odds in the Wildest Campaign in History. Before we jump into our interview with Chris, let's take a look at the news of the day. At least 68 African migrants were killed and 47 injured in a U.S. airstrike on a detention center in Yemen. A widespread power outage has hit Spain, Portugal, Andorra, and parts of France, disrupting daily life and raising concerns about infrastructure vulnerabilities across the region. Russian President Vladimir Putin publicly thanked North Korea for its military support in Ukraine. North Korean troops have reportedly joined Russian forces on the front lines, marking a significant escalation in their partnership and in the ongoing conflict with Ukraine. With that, let's jump into our interview with Chris Whipple. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you recently wrote a book, Uncharted, How Trump Beat Biden, Harris, and the Odds in the Wildest Campaign in History. It offers an outsider's or an insider's account of the 2024 campaign. What were some of the most surprising or revealing moments that you uncovered while reporting on the race?
Well, the moments were many. I guess I'd have to say the stunning thing, the thing that surprised me more than anything else was the amazing extent to which Joe Biden's inner circle convinced themselves that Joe Biden could somehow run for re-election and govern effectively for another 4 years when everyone else, I mean, most of the American people could tell from afar that this guy was just too old to run for re-election. Biden's inner circle were in this kind of fog of delusion and denial, as I've described it. A little bit different from a cover-up, a classic cover-up, and we can talk about that. But that was really the most stunning thing to me.
When did it become clear to those in the inner circle who were willing to recognize it that he wasn't up for the job?
I don't think anybody could pinpoint it or give you a date. I talked to one person who was with the president constantly on Air Force One, on Marine One, in the Situation Room, on calls to foreign leaders. And this person, by the way, is not a Biden loyalist or apologist. But this person told me that it was around Thanksgiving of 2023 that he first noticed Biden having these lapses, mental lapses. But there are other times when he was totally lucid right to the end. I mean, so it's not Joe Biden was not Woodrow Wilson. He was not non-compos mentis sitting in the corner while other people ran the government. And in fact, on the last morning, that fateful morning of July 21, at Rehoboth Beach, when he and Steve Ricchetti and Mike Donilon hammered out that abdication statement, he was on the phone when they arrived that morning, parsing the details of a complex multi-nation prisoner swap. So the inconvenient truth for people who say this was a gigantic conspiracy and everybody knew he was unable to govern is that he had those moments when he was doing just fine.
You write in the book that when he was preparing for his debate with President Trump, which would obviously become his last debate, that he kept coming back to the fact that world leaders thought he was doing great. It does seem to a lot of folks that he was more engaged when it came to global issues and that he was acting more of a George H.W. Bush type president or a Bush senior president.
Yeah,
he seemed to be disengaged when it came to domestic issues. Do you have any sort of thoughts behind why it seemed that he was checked out mentally when it came to doing the job at home but not abroad?
Well, funny you should mention George H.W. Bush because Ron Klain made the same comparison. Joe Biden's first White House chief of staff, who then was in charge of debate prep at Camp David and who told me blow by blow, hour by hour, just how bad that debate prep session had gone. He told me that When Biden arrived, first of all, he was exhausted. He was out of it. He was kind of unable to follow the back and forth between his campaign and Trump's. He was obsessed with foreign leaders. He kept talking about how much Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz loved him. I thought he was doing a great job. He said, so I must be a great president. Klain said to me, it reminded him of George H.W. Bush toward the end of his first term, when Bush, the hero of the Gulf War, who'd had a 90% approval rating coming out of that war, became kind of tuned out of domestic politics and focused totally on foreign affairs, or mostly on foreign affairs. So yeah, there was a real comparison there.
Looking back, do you think that his staff and inner circle could have done anything differently to help his ability to stay in the job for another 4 years, or sort of balance the workload, or was he just?
I don't think there's anything they could have done to have made Joe Biden capable of running for re-election and serving another 4 years. What they could have done, should have done, in my view, is a tragedy, and in many respects it's a scandal, is that no one ever sat the president down. None of these people who are supposed to be clear-eyed, who'd been with him for decades, who told him hard truths in the past, no one ever sat him down and looked him in the eye, and as Leon Panetta put it to me, said, what the blank are you doing here? You're 81 years old. You're going to be 82 when you run and 86 when you finish your term. And it's time to step aside and be what you said you were going to be, which is a bridge, quote unquote, to another candidate. And that had to have happened a year earlier or 2 years earlier in order for that handoff to have been effective, not 107 days before the election.
Who do you think President Biden would have listened to if they would have given him that counsel?
Well, there are a number of people who could have done it. I don't want to pin the blame on anyone in particular, because it's a collective failure, and not just a failure of the inner circle of Biden, but the entire Democratic Party. As Bill Daley, Obama's second White House chief of staff, put it to me, nobody had any freaking balls. Nobody would step up and challenge Biden for the nomination. So it was a failure across the board. But having said that, look, back in 1988, when Joe Biden was running for the nomination against Michael Dukakis and Gary Hart, among others, and he was ensnared in that plagiarism scandal, Ted Kaufman, his best friend, took him aside at one point and said, Joe, it's time. Nobody did that this time around.
Yeah. Obviously, hindsight is 2020, but do you believe the Vice President Harris, would have actually had a fighting shot should he have stepped down sooner?
We'll never know. Now, it's one of those mysteries, unanswerable questions of history. And look, it's possible that if there'd been a primary that started 2 years earlier, that could have ended up with a weaker nominee. Nominees have more time to make mistakes when you've got a longer runway, and Democratic nominees tend to tack to the left. So anything could have happened, but I'm really with Leon Panetta on this. I mean, I spoke to him about it, and he watched that debate the way most of us did, with his jaw on the floor. And he really felt that, look, the only chance the Democrats had was to have had a competitive primary starting a year or two earlier. And the fact that it might have had a bad outcome is no reason not to have it. You gotta do these things in order to be a strong party.
Yeah, well, she obviously locked down support from all the delegates within a couple of days, and you detailed this, how she worked the phones and did this. But she lost. What missteps do you think she took that, in hindsight, she could have avoided?
Well, let's give her credit, as you say, for openers, on having this seamless passing of the baton from Biden. I mean, she grabbed it and ran with it, and it was a political tour de force. In 48 hours, she had the nomination nailed down. And one of the things I write about in the book is how she hadn't been just sitting around waiting for this to happen. She'd been preparing privately, quietly, putting the word out to Democratic operatives who were out there looking at the rules and trying to figure out what to do in the event that Biden stepped aside. And boy, was she ready. And I thought she came out of the convention very strong. It was almost a perfect convention, I think. Then the wheels began to come off. There was a period of time there. And by the way, I have in my book, Uncharted, I talked to the inner circle of all the campaigns, not just Biden, but Harris and Trump. And Susie Wiles told me, that the co-chair of Trump's campaign, that, as she put it, she was brutally candid with me. She said, we couldn't believe how bad she was how she put it. Now, look, I think 107-day campaign may well have been mission impossible for reasons we can talk about. But there was that period coming out of the convention where I think she was not out there doing as many interviews as she could have been doing. She missed that Joe Rogan opportunity. And when she went on ABC's The View, she had the terrible answer to the question she knew was coming. How would you govern differently from Joe Biden? And she whiffed on that. Plenty of mistakes. But having said that, for someone who had run a pretty flawed campaign in 2019, she sure ran a much better one in 2024.
Do you think that her and her team saw the lack of support from Hispanics and Black men, especially, and Black voters, or were they blindsided by this? And did the Trump team see that they actually were picking up real support in these communities? And did they think it was a lasting thing or a temporary bump?
Well, the Trump campaign knew what it was doing, and they really did feel they could pick off those groups who had not traditionally voted come their way. And Harris's campaign saw it happening too in real time, and felt kind of powerless to do anything about it. They tried, they just weren't as good as the Trump campaign in reaching out to those groups. There was no equivalent to that right-wing ecosystem of alternative media and podcasts, Rogan just being the most prominent. So there was that. And then I think also she was running against, she had the fundamental issue, I think, obviously inflation, obviously the border, but maybe bigger than anything else was she had to somehow be a change candidate in a change election as a sitting incumbent vice president. That's pretty tough.
Yeah. I do want to back up a bit, though. Do you think if Biden had refused to get out in July of last year, that at some point Obama would have publicly called on him to get out?
Yeah, I do. I think that fateful weekend of July 2021, when he huddled in Rehoboth Beach at his house with Steve Ricchetti, one of his closest aides, Mike Donilon, his alter ego, the three of them had a real come to Jesus meeting, or I guess you might call it. And the bottom line, after everything else was considered, was they knew that the Democratic Party leadership was going to come down on Joe Biden like a ton of bricks, probably come Monday morning. Certainly very soon, had he not abdicated then. Because Pelosi, as I write about in my book, Pelosi had a private one-on-one with him, a secret meeting at the White House and the residence. They'd all given him the message privately, but he knew they were going to go public in pretty short order, and he couldn't survive that.
Yeah. I also want to you talk about how in 2024, the Trump campaign was much different, more stable, led by Susie Wiles. The backstabbing wasn't really allowed. Chris LaCivita was tough. They didn't deal with shenanigans from people like Corey Lewandowski. But on the other side, it very much seemed, and it's true, that most of the folks who ran Kamala Harris's campaign were holdovers from either her time as vice president or Biden or Obama holdovers from the 2012 races. I think a lot of folks see that the Democratic Party sort of political class very much is stale and has stayed the same in this sense. Did you get the sense that the Trump campaign found their opposition to be mediocre?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you were to ask Susie Wiles, she would say she just couldn't believe again what an ineffective campaign they ran. Now, maybe some of that is trolling, some of that is spiking the football and unfair. But I think that they were surprised by that, her failure to answer that question on The View. They were surprised by her failure to answer the devastating trans surgery commercial that was so effective against her. And again, the backstory on that is fascinating. I write about it in Uncharted, about how they had tested 5 or 6 different responses to that trans ad with focus groups, and finally decided it wasn't worth answering. That was, I think, a big mistake. And there was a fundamental problem too, that the campaign was essentially a Biden campaign until the very end. Jen O'Malley Dillon was running it. Mike Donilon, his closest friend, his closest political aide for sure, was at the top of that as well. It never really fully became a Kamala Harris campaign, in my view. There were a lot of Biden holdovers who were reluctant. I think they were all invested in the Biden record. You wouldn't expect them to tell her, look, you have to break with the president and create some distance. The irony here is that, contrary to some other reporting that you may have seen out there, my sources at the very highest level confirmed to me that Joe Biden had given Kamala Harris the green light to break with him if she had to. Do whatever you have to do, essentially, is what he told her. Don't worry about hurting my feelings. And yet she still couldn't do it in that moment on The View. And I'm told it was really out of a kind of personal loyalty that she felt, this guy brought me to the dance, and I'm not gonna criticize him.
Certainly not as cutthroat as someone like Donald Trump. No. Do you think there's any place in the future of Democratic politics for the Jen O'Malley Dillons of the world? I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine blowing a Super Bowl that badly and bouncing back to manage another one.
Well, it's not just that. Had they simply lost a close Super Bowl, and this was a close election, this was not a landslide, this was not a mandate, no matter what you may hear Donald Trump saying. This was a close election. Had that been the case, they'd absolutely be working in other campaigns in the future and probably in prominent positions. But the real problem, I think, for all of them is that, frankly, this 11th hour abdication by Joe Biden, which left such a short runway for Jen O'Malley Dillon, just 107 days and essentially mission impossible, that's on them. I mean, that is on Joe Biden's inner circle. The people who failed to be clear-eyed about this and to sit him down and say, hey, boss, you sure about this? Maybe it is time to be that bridge. Nobody did it. Nobody stepped up. And Americans are angry about that. Democrats are certainly angry. And frankly, so I think that's going to make it very tough for the people who are around Biden to maybe to have a future on running other races. I think that's just going to be tough.
It's clear that Susie Wild had final say in anything that happened with the Trump campaign, but who had final say within the Biden orbit? Or then Kamala Harris orbit, actually.
Well, I think Kamala Harris had final say. I think that she had the final say on The View when she failed to answer that question and couldn't clean it up. Her advisors. I write about this. Her advisors were watching this in real time and texting each other, "WTF? How do we clean this up now?" While she was still on the air. But she didn't, and she chose not to distance herself from Biden. Look, would it have worked? Who knows? Hubert Humphrey broke with Lyndon Johnson in 1968 over LBJ's conduct of the war in Vietnam. Late in the campaign, it was late October of '68, and he had a surge, and he almost caught Nixon in a photo finish in that campaign. We don't know if that would have happened here. Suppose Harris had said, when asked that question, how will you govern differently? Suppose she'd said, look, I'm proud of A, B, C, and D that Joe Biden and I did, but you know what? We blew it on inflation, and I'm here to tell you this is how I'm going to fix that. I am my own person. I'm not Joe Biden. Here's my plan. That didn't happen. And we'll never know whether it would have worked.
Do you think any other Democratic candidate would have won or could have won?
I just think if you'd had a competitive primary that had begun a year or 2 years earlier, I think there's every reason to believe that the Democrats might have produced a stronger nominee, and it might have been Kamala Harris. She might have been strengthened by having gone through a real competitive primary. Or it might have been Gretchen Whitmer or Gavin Newsom or J.B. Pritzker or Josh Shapiro or Andy Beshear. We just don't know.
Do you think that President Biden and his orbit recognized the harm he did to his legacy?
No, I think they're in denial. To this day, I think most of them are in denial. And I say that because look at the speech that Joe Biden gave in Chicago recently. I don't know how many days after the election, but plenty of time to reflect on what had happened here. And all he had to do, in my view, was acknowledge the elephant in the room. If he'd had any, really clear, maybe he wasn't talking to his advisors at that point. Nobody could, but he blew it. He had an opportunity to say, you know what, I did a lot of things as president, but boy, when I make a mistake, it's a doozy. And here's what I should have done. I should have been a bridge to a younger candidate much earlier than 107 days. I now know that. And then tell us whatever he wants to tell us about Social Security. But who's going to listen to Joe Biden on the subject of Social Security or anything else until he owns that? I think he needs to do that.
What do you think his legacy is, though? How do you think history remembers him one day after he's gone?
Well, it's mixed, but at the end of the day, it's tarnished. He began as a consequential president, and I wrote a book about this called "The Fight of His Life" inside Joe Biden's presidency. The first 2 years of his administration, he did some, undebatably consequential things. He pulled the economy out of a free fall that Trump had left it in. He managed the pandemic, not without some mistakes, but very effectively. He passed more bipartisan legislation than anyone since LBJ. He rallied NATO to face down Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. He tackled global warming. This is a guy who had, he created 16 million jobs and the CHIPS Act, and I could go on. This was a substantial record, and unfortunately, his failure to be realistic about running for re-election, his inability, really, to successfully run for re-election, it turns out to be a tragedy. I mean, the story ends in tragedy, and it's Shakespearean. I mean, I think, with all the twists and turns and betrayals and ending in that really sad weekend of July 2021.
Yeah. You, in 2017, to shift gears a bit, wrote a book, The Gatekeepers, about presidents' chiefs of staffs. Obviously, when President Trump was first elected 9 years ago, his first chief of staff lasted for 6 or 7 months. Second chief of staff, not much longer. He went through 3 or 4 of them, despite efforts from his son-in-law and daughter to actually have an understanding. You spent a lot of time with them. Why is it that none of them could succeed in the role? And do you think Susie Wiles can make it past the first year?
Well, in his first term, talk about mission impossible. It really was for not one, but 4 White House chiefs who failed one after the other, ending in the most hapless of all, Mark Meadows, who was really, in my view, and I wrote about this, the worst White House chief of staff in history. But in fairness to them, the fundamental problem was that Trump had no use for a White House chief of staff, didn't want a White House chief of staff, thought he knew everything about governing. And by the way, wasn't the first to think so. Jimmy Carter thought he was so smart that he could essentially run the White House himself.
And he relied on an individual who had a cocaine problem, famously.
Well, and Ham Jordan was also just not cut out to be White House chief. He was the most disorganized guy. He was practically sleeping in his car. This was a guy who never returned phone calls to Capitol Hill. Anyway, ultimately, he found the right guy in Jack Watson, who was a brilliant lawyer and ex-Marine who was his chief the last year. Too late for Jimmy. Donald Trump had no use for a White House chief his first go-around, but he did learn something, and he learned it not in the White House, but I think on the campaign trail. He learned that Susie Wiles was someone who knew what she was doing. He had a great working relationship with her. He trusted her, and trusts her to this day more than any of her predecessors as White House chief. And she has a kind of magic with him. She can bring some discipline to his chaos, emphasis on the word some, but she can do it. And so I think that she's going to be around for a while as White House chief. I'd give her a real mixed report card, but I think she's not going anywhere for a while.
Who do you think would try to knife her?
Well, I think you try to knife her at your peril, because the short answer is nobody who's smart will try that. Not even Elon Musk has tried that up to this point, because they understand that she has this relationship with Trump. Trump trusts her. When she says something, they know that she speaks for Trump. And that goes a long way to tamping down all that internecine warfare that happened during the first term. We're not seeing that this time around, even though there's certainly been some chaos, but the White House is a much tighter ship under Susie.
Yeah, he obviously left office in 2021 under, to say the least, poor circumstances. The riot at the Capitol, several convictions coming down the pike. If you have to
management of COVID.
Yeah. If you had to fast forward a bit, let's say we're sitting here in January 2029. 1, do you think he leaves office? Is there a world where he can stay? 2, what do you think the country will be saying about him on January 21st, 2029?
Well, I'm not Nostradamus, so that's certainly way above my ability. But I think a lot is going to depend on whether he learns anything. And about governing, and the problem that Trump has always had is that he's a genius at campaigning. He has a feral, sort of reptilian genius. I mean, instincts that are very good as a campaigner. But as Ronald Reagan's last White House chief of staff, a guy named Ken Duberstein, whom I knew pretty well, loved to say that there's a difference between campaigning and governing. Campaigning, you try to destroy your opponent. Governing, you make love to them. Trump has never understood the difference, and to this day, I don't think has learned how to govern. Now, so a lot is going to depend on Susie Wiles. There would have been no Reagan revolution without James A. Baker III, who was Reagan's quintessential chief of staff, who could talk him out of crazy things. Who, for example, said early on to Ronald Reagan, who wanted to go after Social Security, he said, no. That's the third rail of American politics. You touch it, you'll be electrocuted, believe me. And Reagan pivoted to the economy, and the rest is history. Susie Wiles, I think, tried to argue with Trump about tariffs. And maybe in retrospect, she should have sat him down and said the same thing, that this is the third rail. Really, you're going to tank the economy. Let's not go there. Clearly, Trump decided he was going to go there.
Frankly, it doesn't matter. We've seen him face every type of controversy, from famously Pussygate in 2016, for lack of better words, where he described sexual assault, to Russian interference, to the January 6th riots. What could take him down permanently?
Oh, it matters, because if he tanks the economy the way he almost did with tariffs just a few weeks ago, before backing down. If he does that, then it's going to be a disastrous presidency. It was a disastrous presidency the first time around, when he tried to pretend that there was no pandemic and presided over, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. Lost more jobs than any president since Herbert Hoover. So, he's going to have to learn or demonstrate that he's learned something since the first term. And part of that, I think, is going to be working and listening to people who tell him unpleasant truths.
Do you get the sense he had a plan with the tariff rollout, or was it last minute and ham-fisted? Does he have an exit strategy as well, or an off-ramp?
I think it's always a mistake. And I'm kind of with Michael Wolff on this, who's written about Trump a lot, as I have. It's always a mistake to assume that there's some kind of three-dimensional chess going on with Ronald Reagan. And I think it's with Trump.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the mythology is that he spent 4 years thinking about everything and planning things. And he had all these people on Project 2025 who had everything lined up and knew exactly what they were doing. And it's just not true. And we're starting to see that. I mean, this was shock and awe, so-called, is not an effective governing strategy. And we're starting to see that now. 80% of what he's thrown at the wall has been blocked by court orders of one kind or another. There's wheels are coming off in various ways. And so I think, again, prioritizing is really important. That's something that if he listens to Susie Wiles, he might figure out.
Do you have any thoughts on how the media should cover Trump differently this time? It seems like they're still covering him the same way as they did 8 years ago, sort of day-by-day stories. But what should the media do differently in their coverage of him?
I don't know. I think the media just needs to be relentless. Just try to cover it as aggressively as possible. Do not bend the knee. Be 60 Minutes, not ABC. Be Harvard, not Columbia. I'm being a little bit facetious here, but fight the fight. Go after the truth. And speak to everyone. Report without fear or favor. and just try to do your job.
Okay. Chris Whipple, thank you so much for the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for tuning in to this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Join us next time.